Hi folks, and welcome to my latest video. We all need a haven to retreat to now and again, and this is mine in miniature form. A secluded, tranquil cove. I hope you enjoy watching me bring it to life. Let's crack on. This is a nice big block of extruded polystyrene, onto which I drew the basic layout of my cove. And to cut the foam, I used the Hot Wire Foam Factory's hand routing tool. This has a thick blade that can be moulded to shape when cool, obviously. And then when you switch it on, it produces rather satisfying cuts. The trick here is to take your time, go slowly and allow the blade to do the cutting. By which I mean don't force it, just let the blade sink through the foam. And you can see here that it produces quite a few angel hairs, or whatever you want to call them, but these can just be torn away easily. Of course, the blade can also be used to scoop out pieces of foam easily. And I should mention that you really do need to do this in a well ventilated room because the fumes it gives off aren't too nice. In fact, wear a mask like I was here. And at the end of that first stage of carving, I ended up with a dish like this. An open-ended dish because the sea would have to come in somewhere. So now it was time to carve some more detail into the cliffs. I wasn't looking for precise detail at this point, just the general shape of the rocks. And you can see here how moulding the shape of the blade can give you any manner of cuts. And that's stage 2 of the sculpting complete. Stage 3 involved using a very sharp knife. This is a florist's knife. Do be extremely careful while carving foam with a sharp knife because you can get slippage where the foam breaks away suddenly, and any hands in the way can suffer some rather nasty injuries, obviously. Anyway, I'm using the knife here just because it gives you a little bit extra control. One false slip with a hot wire and you might cut all the way through a rock that you wanted to keep. And all we really want to do is take the sharp edges off and even out any obscure details that the hot wire may have left in the foam. And when it comes to shaping the cliff at the back of the cove into that nice kind of dish or bowl shape, the knife just gives that extra bit of control. It's important to flatten out the bed or the beach as much as possible. leaving a nice slope that will descend under the waves. And that's stage 4 of the carving complete. Stage 5 is just going over everything, or most of it, with a piece of sandpaper. This is 400 grit, so it's quite fine. This just takes off any of the remaining sharp edges that might poke through the sculptor mould, and it also helps the sculptor mould adhere to the foam. Again, try to make the beach area as flat as possible. When you're done, just turn the model over and give it a tap to get rid of any of the dust and particles of foam. And with the carving done, it's time to apply sculptor mould. This gets mixed to a thick, sticky but not sloppy consistency. Just add a little bit of water at a time. If it gets too sloppy or wet, then it won't stick to the foam very well and it will take ages to dry, and you won't really be able to mould with it very well. And then it's just a case of slapping it on and pushing it about until it covers the areas you want it to cover. Obviously paying attention to how you want it to cover those areas. But the good thing about sculptor mould is you've got a good 20 minutes, or longer in winter like it is here, before it starts really setting up. And even then it remains mouldable for some time. You just wet your finger and push hard into it. The important thing for a piece like this is that because we're going to be applying resin later on, we really want to make sure that the base is thoroughly coated with sculptor mould. This will protect the foam and prevent any reaction between the foam and the resin. And you can see here that as it starts to dry, you can really smooth it out with your finger. If it gets a bit too dry or stiff, then just wet your finger. And again, it's really important to smooth out the beach area as much as possible. Any lumps, bumps, pock marks or divots will really show when we apply the grout later. And I also used some sculptor mould to build up extra rocks around the mouth of the cove. And to build up the rocky cliffs. You don't have to be so careful about smoothing these rocky areas. If you leave them fairly rough, you'll end up with some wonderful rocky texture. Once the sculptor mould is completely dried, you can go over the beach area with a bit of sandpaper. And for the beach itself, I'd be using beige grout, but it was a bit too dark, so I mixed it 50-50 with plaster of Paris. Fastened an old stocking over the cup. Applied some scenic glue over the beach area. And then shook the plaster and grout mix over the glue, being sure to coat the entire area. Any excess that gets onto the rocks can just be brushed clear. The glue on its own is usually enough to hold the grout in place, but because I'd applied quite a thick layer, I decided to go over it with some isopropyl alcohol and then some more scenic glue. Right, so on to painting the rocks, and for this I used a black and a white acrylic, mixed about 50-50, which, if I'm correct, makes grey, so you could use a kind of mid-grey acrylic if you wanted, but I didn't have a big tube of that, so I mixed my own. And because this is just the undercoat, it can be applied with quite a big brush. Just be a bit more careful as you get down towards the grout. To paint a neat line around the sand, it's best to dilute the grey a bit with water just to make the paint flow a bit easier. And that's the first layer of paint done. The first of many. I'm not a big fan of excessive dry brushing. I prefer to go for depth of colour, so for the next layer it was just adding a little bit of a highlight by adding a bit more white and going over the very edges of the rock. And then a further highlight with a bit more white, going over the areas you've just been over, but making sure not to cover the entire highlight underneath. Now I talked about depth of colour, and this stone colour will really start to bring that. It's another highlight layer, but it's a really kind of beige sandstone colour. And it's important to wipe most of the paint off your brush before you apply this. This isn't really dry brushing because the layers underneath are still a little bit wet, so it's more of a wet on wet technique. The next highlight layer is verdigris. This one's by Vallejo. But this doesn't get applied neat, it actually gets mixed into the stone colour and kind of stippled on with a very old brush. Although for larger areas I used a large flat-headed brush. Some black wash helps to accentuate crevices in the rock. And then what I consider a secret weapon in rock painting is Citadel's contrast paint, Griff Charger Grey. It's actually got quite a strong blue hue, and what it does is kind of blend all the other colours in together, drying darker in all the pores and cracks of the rock and lighter over the raised surfaces. Don't worry about it looking too blue to begin with. When it dries a lot more transparent. And now I permitted myself a little bit of dry brushing. This was using the verdigris paint straight from the bottle and applied very lightly indeed over the surface of the rocks just to capture some of the details. For moss on the rocks, is it sea moss when it's near the coast? I'm not sure. I used some Woodland Scenics Green Blend Fine Turf and Mod Podge Matte, mixed together into a fairly dryish paste. And the reason I wanted it dry is because I didn't really want it staining the rock surface too much, and I wanted it to break up a bit over the surface. Nevertheless, it was a bit too dry and it was a bit too thick, so I actually ended up watering it down a little bit. And this gave me the perfect consistency for stippling it over the surface of the rocks. And for spreading it about with my thumb and fingers, allowing it to break up and separate into clumps. And speaking of clumps, for the thicker foliage at the top of the cliffs, I used some Woodland Scenics coarse turf. This is their mid-green variety, and I just put this on loose and let it fall down where it would, into gaps and fissures in the rock. Although when you do this, it's important to brush away the excess from your beach, because otherwise you'll end up gluing that down too. And then give it a good spray with isopropyl alcohol. This breaks the surface tension, allowing the glue to soak through. And again, this is my scenic glue recipe, which is 3 parts matte medium, 1 part water, and a drop of dish soap. For the slimy rocks on the tide line, I mixed some more Woodland Scenics Fine Turf Green blend with Mod Podge Matte. This time into a gooier, stickier consistency, which means more glue and less fine turf, and then painted it on above the waterline, or the planned waterline I should say. To give it that real snotty, slimy look, I used Nurgle's Rot by Citadel, and this I've heard described as basically snot in a pot. Though I have to say it goes on snottier than it dries, which is a good thing in this case. If you think it's all a little bit too vivid, then you can blend it in with some more black wash. And in fact, I found the contrast between the snotty seaweed and the rocks a little bit too great. So I broke up some of the surface of the rocks with some Citadel Typhus Corrosion. This is a slightly textured brownish paint which is mostly used for aging armour. It was at this point that I decided to add a little bit of earth texture along the top of the cliffs. This Armageddon dust is basically like a dusty paint. Maybe I should have done this before applying the foliage, but actually it ended up giving a really nice sense of depth to the piece, with bare rock acting like shadows. And with all that done, it was time to paint the seabed. I started with blue and then moved into yellow via a green wash, and then ended up with a bit of verdigris at the end. The green wash just helped the blue achieve a bit more of a turquoise hue before it went into full-on green via yellow. Or perhaps I should say turquoise. You can see here I went a little bit too thick with the verdigris, and my blending efforts were unsuccessful until I used a little bit of isopropyl alcohol, which kind of washed out my green, but it looked alright. And anyway, I was keen to get on with pouring the resin, and the first stage of this was to build a dam. And the first stage of building a dam is to apply a bead of glue around the edge of the opening, and then to apply your damming material over that, in this case a piece of tape. This is a very thick polythene tape, and while it sticks to most things very well, it doesn't like sticking to foam, hence the glue. And some more glue is applied around the edges of the tape, just to completely seal it against leaks. Because the last thing you want is epoxy resin leaking all over your table and your carpet and whatever else. Anyway, this particular epoxy by CFS here in the UK is mixed 50-50 by volume, and in this case I actually mixed both parts together before mixing in the tint. It needs mixing for a couple of minutes or so. Go fairly slowly so as not to introduce too many bubbles. Rather than use acrylic paints, I use glass paints to tint my resin. That's because they have a transparent, glossy quality. A little goes a long way, so just introduce small amounts at a time. I started with blue and then added a small amount of green to give it that turquoise hue again. When you pour the resin, just be careful not to get it over any of the rocks. It's very hard to clean off. This brand of resin is quite thick, so I usually tease the edge of it to avoid leaving a lip. And I use a soldering torch to burst any bubbles that rise to the surface. Just a quick pass with the torch will do. Try to avoid setting light to any of the foliage. And you can see that the dam wasn't the sturdiest I've ever made, so I ended up having to support it with an old book wrapped in paper. And then it was on to waves, and by far my favourite product to use at the moment is Water Ripples by Woodland Scenics. They also do a water waves, but at this scale the ripples is much better. And you can see that I've left the lip there where the resin climbs up the dam, because this actually acts as a dam for the ripples material, which is a kind of runny gel, not too dissimilar from transparent caulking material that's been thinned down. And basically, as it starts to set up, you create ripples in it with your paintbrush. Although it does take a fairly long time to dry, as you can see by my attempts here to lay down ripples that then disappear almost immediately. Eventually though, you'll hit that window where the ripples start lingering for longer and then staying put. But you don't want to miss that window or you'll end up creating very jagged looking ripples. So you're probably going to end up sitting by your model for quite some time. I think I was sat by this one for about 2 hours. But that's mainly because I realised I'd screwed up the shoreline. Basically there was too much of a harsh transition between the paint and the grout. So I ended up scraping back some of the curing ripples effect. And then mixing some fresh gel in with a little tiny bit of glass paint and blending in the shoreline. This looked a bit streaky at first, but as the product spread out, the paint bloomed in it and gave me the effect I was after. And here you can see how the shoreline has been softened considerably. And a small amount of Neat Ripples gel over the top of the tinted gel just added a bit more sparkle, and then some water texture by Vallejo helped smooth out the transition as the water hit the beach. For the surf I just lightly stippled over some white acrylic, being sure not to go too heavy and trying to achieve a web-like look. This also helped with blending in some of the tinted waves. And I also used the end of my paintbrush to paint some straighter waves along the shore. The contrast paint had left some of the rocks a little too shiny for my liking, so some matte varnish sorted that out. And the final stage was bulking out some of the foliage, and for this I used some products by Diorama or Presepe, a wonderful Italian manufacturer, and this foliage product is a lot like Woodland Scenics fine leaf foliage. being essentially coarse turf applied over natural seafoam armatures in such a way that you can shake them really hard and none of the coarse turf will come off. They do a really good job of representing large bushes or even small trees at this scale. You can see I used a light yellowish green and a dark green variety. And then I blended these two colours together using a bit more mid-green coarse turf, which I fixed in place using more isopropyl alcohol and then scenic glue. And that was that. I do hope you enjoyed watching this video. Thanks for joining me while I brought this little scene to life. If you'd like written tutorials on exciting projects I've completed that aren't on my YouTube channel, head over to my Patreon page where you can sign up for monthly written tutorials and access all previous tutorials once you become a member. Thanks again for watching. Take care everyone. Cheerio!